On this episode of Church and Main, we take a look at what's going on in Gaza. That's coming up. Hello and welcome to Church and Main, a podcast for people interested in the intersection of faith, politics, and culture. I'm Dennis Sanders, your host. As I'm recording this, the United Nations is gathering for the General Assembly meeting in New York. This happens every fall, so that's nothing new. But what is new is that this is happening as many nations, including the UK, France, Australia, Canada, and a whole host of other nations, are recognizing Palestine as a state, to the chagrin of Israel and the United States. Now, I personally don't think that this is a good idea, and it's not because I don't agree with the idea of a state for the Palestinians. I actually believe that they do deserve a state to call their own. I actually believe in the idea of a two-state solution. I don't think that it's a good idea because I just don't think that you get statehood for Palestinians just because other nations declare it. That happens really through hard negotiations like what happened during the Oslo Accords back in the 1990s. My guess is that all of this is happening really not to help the Palestinians. It's really to send a message to one nation, to Israel, because of what is going on in Gaza. It's been 2 years since the horrors of October 7th, 2023, when Hamas staged a terror attack, leaving 1,200 Israelis dead and 200 hostages. And this then led to a devastating military operation in Gaza by the Israeli Defense Force that is still going on nearly 2 years later. The Gaza Health Ministry, which it must be stated is run by the Hamas-run government of Gaza, so you have to take this with a big grain of salt, says that about 60,000 Gazans have died during these last 2 years of war. But even if those numbers are in dispute, it's hard to ignore the pictures of devastation that we see and also the stories of the humanitarian crisis that is unfolding in Gaza. So in this episode, I wanted to talk to someone about this, and so I invited back Todd Stavrakos on the podcast to talk about what's going on concerning Gaza. I talked to Todd shortly after October 7th, and so I wanted to have him back on the podcast. Todd is an ordained pastor in the Presbyterian Church USA, and he's also executive director of Pathways for Middle East Peace. This organization is a nonprofit educational group that works to support collaboration between mainline churches and the Jewish community. I hope that you will, and this will be a helpful episode. I will actually have someone on in a few weeks that will bring another perspective on on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict that I also hope that will be enlightening. But for now, here is my conversation with Todd Stavrakos. All right, Todd, thank you for coming back on the podcast.
My pleasure.
I wanted to start off by talking a little bit about what Pathways for Peace is all about, and then maybe to relate that into some of the current situations. But kind of before we dive into what's going on with everything with Israel and Gaza, just what is Pathways for Peace?
So Pathways for Peace is an organization whose primary work is to reach out to the mainline Christian community and to work with them as well as the Jewish community to strengthen the historic relationships. We understand that the issue of Israel and Palestine has become, in some regards, a wedge issue. between the two communities. But a large part of that is because of a lack of information, a lack of sort of a productive means to discuss these things, and that sort of both sides have some assumptions about the other side
Hmm.
that aren't necessarily true. And so our goal is to help foster those conversations, to educate people in the Jewish community, legacy organizations, community groups about what mainline Protestants are concerned about, and then vice versa, to work with the Jewish community so that they understand, what's going on in the mainline world, and how the mainline Protestants are working on issues of peace and justice. Um, we find that when we actually have productive conversations over the issues, that people realize that they have a lot in common,
Hmm.
and that they are more than willing to then reach across and work together on many of these issues that concern us, not just locally or regionally in the United States, but also working hand in hand with groups in Israel and Palestine that are seeking to plant the seeds for peace and to raise a new generation who can hopefully create the environment where peace can prevail.
Okay. So looking at hearing about that, and thank you for sharing that.
Mm-hmm.
And we look at kind of the current situation that's going on, which, at least from the other side of the world, looks horrific. Um,
Yeah,
and
it
really
is
all the way
horrific.
around. I mean, just
Yeah,
what's going on in Gaza, but then also what's going on in Israel as well. There's a lot of dissatisfaction. Obviously, we're seeing a desperate situation in Gaza, but also a heartbreaking situation in Israel with the continuing issue with the hostages and all of that.
right.
How would you kind of, and on top of that, everyone has their own kind of narratives on all of this that I don't always think are helpful,
Right.
but how do you suss out how would you describe this situation and that's going on right now?
One, it's horrific. I mean,
Hmm.
the present situation for the Palestinians residing in Gaza is desperate, and the real shame is that it's no through no fault of their own.
Hmm.
Um, these are people, and this unfortunately has been the case for the Palestinian people kind of since the conflict began. That you've had Palestinian leadership, Israeli leadership, who have taken certain actions that completely ignored the realities of the Palestinian people themselves. And we're seeing this, to a desperate level in Gaza presently. Um, you've got the Gazans are stuck between Hamas and the IDF. Hamas that doesn't care at all about what happens to the population, and the IDF who is trying to win a war, um, with limited success, to be honest with you. So the average Gazan has lost their home, lost any sort of means of employment, resources. Um, as we all know, supply chains of food, water, have been disrupted. What's presently happening is probably not the best way of distributing humanitarian aid. And there's a lot of fault to be spread around from Israel to Hamas to the UN to the world community. I would not just heap the coals upon one party here. There's plenty of blame to go around. Um, but you're right. In the state of Israel itself, it's not a good situation. You have a government that is highly unpopular, that represents sort of like the worst in humanity, so to say. They've demonstrated absolutely no sympathy and empathy towards the Palestinian people, in much the same regard as our government is highly unpopular, showing absolutely no regard for immigrants, migrant workers, people of color. There's some scary similarities here. And and in many regards, where both of our nations are waiting for the next election to maybe make a mark. And in Israel, that's the same case. And you see that there's more and more anti-war protests developing in Israel. There's larger and larger protests from supporters of the hostages who see their government doing absolutely nothing to bring them home. And they're becoming appalled at the humanitarian crisis that's going on in Gaza. And so, in many regards, it's good people who are completely disempowered because the powers that be. And so it's it's a tragic situation. I wish I could come out with a happier perspective, but it's hard to right now. And you're right. Everybody is using what's happening as a litmus test for their own political talking points. Any expression of support by the West for the Palestinian people of Gaza is seen by the state of Israel and classified as support for Hamas and terrorists. The inability to kind of thread the needle on this and to walk that fine line and understand on both sides is shameful.
Yeah, it's interesting. A few days ago, I was just watching it's a video that's put out by Australian Broadcasting that kind of actually had the history of the Oslo Accords, and how Norway was kind of able to bring both sides together, and you kind of look back at that time of both sides really at least trying, and
Right.
again, not perfect, but at least trying to do something of bringing about peace. And it seems like we're a long way from that.
We are. There was so much hope around the Oslo agreements, and since they started at such a low level, it sort of was sprung upon the world, and people who had no hope in the situation all of a sudden were hopeful. You obviously had, there was some caution on both sides, but there was certainly plenty of opportunities, and Gaza represents kind of like the failure of that process, to a large part because of political desires instead of peace desires. You had, after Jericho was given the ability of self rule through Oslo, the next major region to have that was Gaza, when Ariel Sharon decided, you know what, we can't keep spending the amount of money that we're spending um, to protect the settlers that were in Gaza. And so he said, unilaterally, he withdrew. Gaza was then placed under the authority of the Palestinian Authority. Unfortunately, a year later, because the PA was corrupt, the Fatah faction was corrupt, there was a general election. Hamas, who used that corruption against Fatah and won the election, um, then you had a situation where uh, Fatah wasn't willing to recognize that election. You had a civil war breakout in Gaza
Mm-hmm.
between Hamas and Fatah. Hamas won that as well. Um, and then because there was general distrust with Hamas, and I think probably rightly so, Israel begins the blockade. And even the resources that came into Gaza that could get through a blockade, like cement, etc., building materials, instead of using it to build up Gaza, it was used to build tunnels. And once again, the Palestinian people are caught in between. Hamas leadership, whose only desire was to destroy Israel, and so they could have cared less about the people. So what started out as this hopeful thing with Oslo, the failings led us kind of to this point. Um, the huge decision of Arafat at Camp David not to sign the final agreements, which then led to the Second Intifada. Again, whether he was right to walk away or not, the reality was it has set us on this path to where we are now, where Israel does not trust the Palestinians do not trust Israel. Here we are.
What do you make of some of the leadership, especially well in on the Israeli side, um, especially within Benjamin Netanyahu's cabinet, um, that are rather hardline in their viewpoints.
That's a polite
Um,
way of describing them.
I know. I now their names are leaving me, but they're both very hardline and have said things that almost make it sound like they're tantamount to advocating ethnic cleansing. And you know, what is their influence within the government, and how are they in some ways helping to perpetuate what's going on in Gaza?
So we're now seeing kind of the challenge of ruling through a coalition government.
Mm-hmm.
That Netanyahu, who's part of the Likud party, he formed a coalition after the last election, and the coalition, in order to be brought together, is made up of some extreme far right, hardline Israelis who could care less about Palestinians, whether in Gaza, the West Bank, or even in the state of Israel itself. Um, and while I don't think these hard right positions are representative of the larger government or even the state of Israel, because it's a coalition and because Netanyahu needs them in that coalition, their voices carry a long way. They're able to hold up anything, if they really want to. Um, Smotrich and Ben Gvir are able to, the fact that one is in charge of the police and the other is in charge of the West Bank, the occupied territories, and how they talk. Um, it it it's scary and it's
Mm-hmm.
sad that you have these two voices who are in government in the state of Israel.
Mm. Yeah, and I think you were saying earlier about how you saw the parallels between the Netanyahu government and our own government here
Correct.
under Donald Trump, and I do see that, and
Yes.
they're both unsettling in that way, and
Correct.
how they operate, and it's a very kind of black and white world.
Yeah, it's a black and white world, but it's also a willingness to believe sort of like the incomprehensible.
Mm-hmm.
Let's not forget we are a nation whose our health and human services secretary is somebody who's admitted to having a brain worm,
Mm-hmm.
and has come up with some cockamamie things.
And
Um,
every day it seems like that is true.
yeah, and so we're not immune to these realities, and maybe in Israel they came out first, but there is tremendous similarity between a far right agenda that has captured, even though it's probably the minority position in both governments, but they've captured the leadership in such a way that we as Americans and Israelis as Israelis are stuck with.
Yeah. So I wanted to actually also talk about the what's happening on the other side in Gaza is also interesting. And it's also interesting to see something that I only hear a little bit from some people on Twitter or X, and that is that there are actually sometimes demonstrations within Gaza
Yeah,
against Hamas rule, but we almost never hear about that. And
right.
um, is there anything that you can kind of or share about that?
Well, it's a failing of Western journalism, and part of that failure is that they're not allowed within Gaza.
Mm-hmm.
That the IDF has not allowed reporters, journalists, to be in Gaza. The only main sources of information that tend to come out are reporters from Al Jazeera or other Arab news agencies. So we're sort of dealing with information that it might not be 100% accurate, but also there's a slant. And in the West, and particularly in the US newspapers, there's a failure to acknowledge that while Israel and the IDF um, probably have not prosecuted this war in the best way, there's a failure to recognize that Hamas was the de facto government of Gaza, and that as that government, Hamas also has the requirement to protect its people. That has not been happening.
Hmm.
We don't hear about that. That's not talked about. We haven't heard about the protests on the ground in certain regions where people have come out protesting Hamas. And then many of the leaders who have been brutally murdered by
Yeah,
Hamas
yeah.
in response. That's not covered in our news media because honestly, it doesn't fit the narrative. We in the United States are narrative driven. And we get stuck to our narratives, including our journalists. And so we're not necessarily getting the full picture of things. We're not getting a full picture of the humanitarian crisis. There continues to be a complete denial that while the situation it has not been optimal and that Israel shares some responsibility for that, there has not been the equal criticism of the UN's failings, as well as the reality that Hamas, while it has been militarily kind of decreased in its ability, still controls much of Gaza, and has been stealing supplies and then reselling them on a black market to raise money for their efforts. That has not been given adequate representation in our news. Um, the continued denials of the UN that Hamas had infiltrated the UN. We know that's true. We know that over the years, Hamas has infiltrated not just the UN, but other Western NGOs. There was a high ranking member of World Vision who is charged with embezzling $4 million from World Vision and funneling it into Hamas's coffers. We know these things are happening, and yet we don't give them equal weight uh, on the Hamas side that we give, what's happening that we believe is Israel's responsibility. So there's a lot going on that we as Americans don't hear about. And
Hmm.
this is not to absolve Israel from responsibility here, but this is to say that this is a problem that's been created by Hamas and Israel, and both are responsible for this situation.
Yeah, it's always interesting to look at the news, and for me, it's always been trying to figure out what is the real situation happening. Um, there are people who will say basically almost to the point of saying that there isn't any starvation happening. I don't think that's true, but I'm not certain we're not talking Ethiopian famine either, but so it's hard to kind of suss out what is the real story going on. And then for me, it's also frustrating because if you read things like the New York Times and articles, the thing that's always kind of going on in the back is, are we getting the full picture, or is this just one part of the story? Um, and so I think that there are bad things happening, but it's really hard because it's really this thing of narratives going on. And sometimes what I just would like to hear is just what are the facts, and then how do we solve this? But it feels like everything is always who who can we blame for this? And I see that on all
Well,
sides, and it's to me it's not helpful.
and that's and you hit the nail on the head. I mean, we're not getting the clearest picture. Is there a humanitarian crisis? Absolutely. Are there people who are probably going hungry? Absolutely. Are there people who probably are suffering from illness and disease? Absolutely. Um, it, and it hasn't helped that there are certain agencies over the last 2 years who have been saying there's a famine in Gaza. There's a famine in Gaza when there wasn't. Um, and other and like agencies who were completely criticizing sort of the state of Israel without taking blame themselves. We've known that there have been large supplies that had been left at the border region because the UN has refused to act in such a way to bring those supplies uh, into the heart of Gaza. You know, and again, I'm certainly not trying to absolve Israel of the situation and their responsibilities, but the narratives we get, they attempt to make it good versus bad, and there's good on both sides, there's bad on both sides, and to just label one side as the bad and the other side the good, which is what we see on college campuses, misses the point.
Hmm. Yeah, I don't think that that helps, and it doesn't. Well, it seems like that can lead to some dangerous outcomes.
Correct. Correct. Yeah, I mean, anything that Hamas is able to use to spin in their favor is not good because that allows them to remain in power. And um, there's no doubt that the Palestinian people need a new leadership to arise, not just in Gaza, but in the West Bank, the occupied territories. This leadership that's presently constituted has done a disservice to the Palestinian.
One question that I've always had, and maybe I don't know if this is something that you can answer, is how the war has been conducted in Gaza. Um, at least from what because I've not been there, but it seems like it's a very dense part of the world. And so, and I do understand that Hamas has built tunnels and all of that, but you also see just the amount of devastation that has taken place. And I think I always have questions of, was this the right way of how to go about doing this? Um, or was this just a case that they didn't have a choice in the matter? I don't know, but I've always wondered about that was there a way of doing this without creating so much damage?
I, I'll leave that to history to decide. I mean, I'm not a military expert. Um, in the past, the IDF would pursue kind of precision strikes
Mm-hmm.
in an attempt to eliminate whether it's the launchers that Hamas and or the Islamic Jihad would use, or they would try and identify kind of command and control regions, or they would try to identify leadership. This was different from the start because the stated desire of Israel as in this endeavor was to eliminate Hamas, which kind of went along the lines of, I think, what military historians would say total war. And again, I'll let history decide, like, if this was the best avenue or not, but it was very different than what we had seen in previous um, fighting between Hamas and the IDF.
Mm-hmm.
Usually it was sort of like a tit for tat sort of situation. Hamas would launch rockets, the IDF would respond, and then after a week or two, there would be some sort of armistice agreed to. This one was completely different, and I think those of us on the outside looking in, um, eh, because we're sort of foreign from, right? We in the United States have been very fortunate. Since the Civil War, we haven't had wars fought in our territory. We have not seen the devastation of war. And I think for us to watch what was happening, um, it was shocking.
Mm-hmm.
And again, whether, at least from the Israel side, whether this was the best way of doing things, I can't say. I will say on the other side that let's not forget that Hamas was more than willing to um, attack in places where it was civilian populations,
Of
which
course.
we know is a war crime. So whereas we can question the IDF and their response and the tactics, we certainly know that Hamas, their tactics, um, and their method of operating is completely against sort of the Geneva Convention, and even when we consider an insurgency, there is insurgents usually will never allow the people that they're fighting for to be the recipients of rockets and attacks. You do things to keep them out of harm's way, and Hamas didn't care, which led to further destruction.
So this kind of brings down to how does the church respond on this? And part of my, one of my, the reasons for the question I'm going to ask now is that I've noticed something, especially among mainline churches in the last few, maybe year or so, as a progression that maybe I'm not surprised it's happening, but I saw it within your denomination with the Presbyterian Church, and then now within my own um, groups that were kind of like Israel-Palestine groups have just kind of become Palestine groups.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And I find that disturbing because the problem with what's going on in Israel-Palestine isn't just one side. And I've always long believed that what's going on, it's not just one side is good, the other side's bad. There's a whole lot of gray in there.
Right.
And so I guess my question is, how should the church respond to this? And how is it responding? And how, yeah, basically, how should they respond and how are they responding?
Well, it's funny. Let me talk about this by talking about another issue. So we know that the IRS, has lifted the ban in terms of churches endorsing political candidates.
Mm-hmm.
And so there was a Lutheran pastor in Kenosha, Wisconsin, who was
Yep.
recently removed because he was going to endorse AOC. And so there was an article that I recently read where, yeah, the stated clerk of the Presbyterian Church USA, of which I'm a member, said that when we take political sides, we lose our prophetic voice. Well, we lost that prophetic voice on this issue when we quote unquote took a side. When we decided that there was going to be a good and evil in this scenario, and that good was represented by the Palestinians and evil was represented by the state of Israel, and unfortunately also the American Jewish community, we lost our prophetic role. We lost our ability to call out the sin on both sides. We've lost the ability to call out the right wing extremist government of the state of Israel, as well as call out the barbaric actions of Hamas. Our churches aren't able to condemn Hamas because they've given support to it through their actions and clear condemnations of the state of Israel and everything that Israel represents. All of the mainline denominations are having movements that are described as anti-Zionist. That is a clear it's a clear statement against the right of the Jewish people of self-expression, self-determination. Um, that's a clear statement that Israel is a rogue state that shouldn't exist. And so you're giving favor and curry to terrorists, but at the same time, they don't prop up the people on the ground who are committed to working side by side for peace. Years ago, I offered an opportunity for my denomination to work with groups on the ground that were working for peace. They didn't want to. They didn't want to support anything that would bring Israelis and Palestinians together because that was seen as justifying the occupation. Folks, we have slipped so far from what we are supposed to be as peace builders. We need to be calling out the sin on both sides. And at the same time, we need to be lifting up the good people who are in this environment still doing the good work of peace building. But we don't as mainline churches. You're right. We used to have the Israel-Palestine Mission Network within, Peace USA. Um, we all knew it really wasn't Israel-Palestine Mission Network. It was really how do we support the Palestinians and how do we castigate Israel at every turn. But they've at least dropped the moniker of Israel, so we know the truth of their agenda. But this is the church. The church has failed for decades on this issue. And I don't just mean mine. I mean the mainline Protestant churches have failed because they haven't called out the sin on both sides. And so, why would the Jewish community see us as arbiters of peace if we are not prophetic in our role? We don't have a role in this anymore. We really don't. Going forward, the only thing we can do, in my opinion, as Christians, as faith leaders, is to find those groups who still believe in peace and support them.
Why do you think that the mainline church has done this? I mean, why do you feel like they've basically picked a side instead of trying to be an arbiter of peace?
We are stuck in the framework of America. Part of that framework is an acknowledgement of our racist history.
Mm-hmm.
Our mainline denominations have turned into social justice warriors. Not that the gospel doesn't call us to work for justice in our society, but we are not called first and foremost to be social justice warriors.
No.
And we've gone down that road so far that everything has to do with our guilt, our understanding of literally a black and white world. And so, after the Michael Floyd murder, all of us went through this great study of racism. And here in Philadelphia, we did the same thing. And there were many, many conversations about race. And many, Jewish communities, synagogues were involved in this conversation, but they were castigated in these discussions because they weren't recognized as being Jews who have their own ethnicity. They were just labeled as white. And since they were white, they were part of the white supremacist movement. So our denominations have been sucked into that so far that what we do is we see, and we hear this narrative all the time that, the Ashkenazi leadership of Israel. Well, what does that mean? Well, that means the European leadership, the white leadership. But that completely ignores all the other Jews from around the world, including Ethiopians or Yemenis or Iraqis, people who born and raised in Northern Africa, who are not white. And so, but we completely ignore that. So we view Israel-Palestine and the conflict through our own racial lens instead of viewing it through the lens of two national movements that are both legitimate, both have a claim to the land. And we, as Christians, are called to be prophetic and to say, we need to get together and build peace.
Hmm. Yeah, I think I may have told you this the last time we were on, when I went to our General Assembly a few years ago. A resolution actually did pass that basically equated Israel as an apartheid state,
Right.
which I didn't support. And I think it's frustrating because this isn't to me about taking sides, it's about how do you bring these two sides together which is difficult. But I think the other problem is that when we start to use some of this language, I don't know how you can not start running into down the road towards anti-Semitism. Um, it just seems like that's going to be a problem at some point. That yes, you should be and can be critical of the government of Israel, you should be. But when it becomes this how we are going, it just always seems to end really badly.
Well, it does. And the reality is, um, the whole conversation of apartheid and anti-Zionism or equating Zionism with racism was first originated by the Soviet Union in the
Yeah.
70s and 80s as a means to drive a wedge potentially between the US and Israel, as well as between Israel and the Arab community, and a way for the Soviet Union to get into the Arab nations. Um, the fact that we've picked up talking points from the Soviet Union, and let's not forget, it was Russia in the day of the czars who's the primary purveyor of the Protocols of Zion, which, while was French in its origin, it was the Russian Empire who really put it out there. It's sad that we have people who are leading these conversations who have bought into talking points that were part of the Cold War movement of the Soviet Union. Um, so, be that as it may, now the reality is, we are trying to run the same playbook, or some people are trying to run the same playbook that was used against South Africa, which was a completely different context and reality. And they're trying to run that same playbook in Israel. Completely two separate and distinct realities.
Hmm.
And, you know, you have to study history, you have to know history to realize that that doesn't play out. I mean, you can't spend any time in the state of Israel itself and come away with thinking that it's an apartheid state. Okay. When you have members of the Arab public who are part of parliament, who are part of the Supreme Court, who are leaders in communities, who are business leaders, that in an apartheid, that doesn't happen.
No.
Is there a situation in the West Bank that is not optimal? Is there a situation in the occupied territories that is not optimal? Absolutely. You can't equate it with apartheid. You just can't. And it's one of the reasons why most of the Western governments have not done that, because they realize there's a difference. But that we dumb down things like apartheid, we dumb down things like genocide, makes us feel good when we throw those terms out there, but they don't reflect the truth. And if we in the church don't reflect the truth, then what are we?
Hmm. Well, as we kind of come to the close of this conversation, um, is there, if people want to know more about Pathways for Peace, where should they go?
So go to our website, www.pathways, the number four, peace.org. And you can find out more about us. You can see some of the resources we've put together. Sign up for our email distribution. We had a wonderful webinar at the beginning of summer where we had participants from the Palestinian community and the Israeli community talking about real actions that can occur. And we got 19,000 people on this webinar, and we kept that audience through 3 hours.
Wow.
So 3 hour webinar, and 19,000 people were on it. Um, we're trying to put out real information. We're not interested in talking points. We're not interested in kind of putting a pro-Israel or a pro-Palestinian slant. We just want to put real information out for faith leaders so that as these issues come up, they have a better background. Um, so, yeah, we welcome all. You don't have to be lockstep, with what Pathways says, but we do want people to be educated on this issue. We do want people to understand that there are many voices out there that you're not hearing from that you should be.
And I will add, I think, I can't remember if you guys were involved with Whispered in Gaza, but somehow I got involved or looking into that, and it was helpful to hear that because, again, those aren't voices that you normally hear, and I think that
Right,
that's important.
right, right. And by all means, I mean, there are a lot of good agencies that are trying to do something about Gaza. Um, but they're hard to find. And we're going to try and do something soon that's going to talk more about the humanitarian crisis in Gaza, so that people better understand it, and not with an avenue of saying these people are to blame or these people are to blame, but what is it, and what are some ways that we might be able to kind of alleviate it. So
Well, I think that would be very helpful,
yeah,
especially
yeah,
as this is an ongoing issue. So,
correct.
well, Todd, thank you so much.
Well, thank
Hopefully
you,
we can
Dennis.
talk a little bit more in the near future.
Would love to.
All
Would
right.
love to. All
Take
right,
care.
God bless. Take care.
So if you have thoughts about the episode, send me an email. Send it to churchandmain@substack.com. I will include links to Pathways for Peace. If you want to learn more about the podcast, listen to past episodes, or donate, go to churchandmain.org. You can go to churchandmain.substack.com to read related articles. Subscribe to the podcast on your favorite podcast app and leave a rating or review. That helps others to find the podcast. Feel free, you can make a donation. There are links in the show notes. Also, you can leave a link if you would like to also get your episode in your email inbox. You can do that as well. That is it for this episode of Church in Main. As I always like to say, thank you so much for listening. I'm Dennis Sanders, your host. Take care, everyone. Godspeed, and I will see you very soon.